I signed the house over to my children thinking I was giving them a future. 2 months later, they told me I had to ask permission if I wanted to stay in my own guest room. That was the day I stopped being their mother and started becoming their reckoning. My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm 67 years old, recently retired, and I used to believe that giving my home to my children was the most generous thing I'd ever done. The house sits on a quiet street in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, a 2-story colonial I helped design, room by room, over 30 years ago. My late husband, George, and I raised 3 children within these walls: Ethan, the eldest, Julia, the dreamer, and Michael, the baby who never really grew up. After George passed away 8 years ago, I stayed, maintained the yard, painted the shutters, paid off the last bit of the mortgage. When I retired from my job as a high school librarian last fall, I had no debts, no obligations, just the desire to make sure my kids had something permanent, something rooted. So, after months of conversations and family meetings, I transferred the deed to them jointly. 1/3 each. I told them, "This house is yours now. I trust you to care for it and for each other." At first, it felt right. They thanked me. Michael even cried. Ethan promised to keep the plumbing in shape. Julia painted the hallway and called it our legacy. I moved into the guest room upstairs, telling myself I didn't need space, I needed presence. I wanted to be near my grandchildren. I wanted to hear laughter in the halls again. But something started to shift. It wasn't one thing. It was the way Julia stopped inviting me to dinner when her husband came over. The way Ethan quietly changed the Wi-Fi password and forgot to tell me. Michael began referring to the living room as his space. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe I was just adjusting to retirement, but in the silence between their footsteps and the glances they didn't realize I noticed, I felt something unfamiliar blooming. Distance, calculation, like they were waiting for something, or for me to disappear. It started small, little things I told myself not to overthink. The thermostat was always colder than before. I'd turn it up, and a few hours later, it was back down to 65, Julia said. "We're trying to save energy. You know how utility bills are?" I nodded, even though my fingers ached in the evenings from the chill. My mail started going missing, not the ads or magazines, just the bank statements. One day I found a torn envelope addressed to me crumpled at the bottom of the kitchen trash. When I asked about it, Michael shrugged and said, "Must have been a mistake. Maybe the mailman mixed it up." My favorite chair in the sunroom, one I'd sat in every morning for years, was quietly replaced with a new leather recliner Ethan brought home. "It's more modern," he said. "We're updating the house." He smiled like it was a gift, like I should thank him. Even the family calendar, once neatly color-coded and pinned above the fridge, had vanished. Julia started planning weekend dinners without asking me. Michael's friends came over late at night, laughed loudly in the kitchen I once baked pies in. I began to feel like a tenant in my own home. No one said it outright, but I felt it in the way they moved around me, like I was in the way. Once, I forgot to lock the bathroom door, and Julia's husband barged in. He scoffed, didn't apologize. Later, Julia said, "Well, maybe next time be more careful. This isn't just your house anymore." That sentence lodged in my chest. This isn't just your house anymore. They didn't say it with cruelty, but that almost made it worse, because it meant they believed it. That this place, my place, the one I built from the ground up, was no longer mine. And the scariest part, they weren't trying to hurt me. They just didn't care. It happened on a Wednesday. The kind of cold, gray day where the sky looks like it forgot how to be anything but tired. I had spent the morning at the community center helping an elderly woman sign up for Medicare benefits. It felt good, useful. When I got back, my arms full of groceries. The front door wouldn't open. At first, I thought the lock was jammed. Then I saw the tiny black camera mounted above the porch light. New? Sleek. Watching. I rang the bell. No answer. I called Julia. No reply. Then Ethan. Straight to voicemail. Finally, Michael picked up, his voice oddly calm. "Oh," he said. "Didn't we tell you? We had the locks changed this morning. The new system needs your fingerprint. You'll need to come by this weekend to get added." My stomach dropped. "You changed the locks without telling me." "It's for security," he said. "The text said the old ones were outdated. Look, we'll fix it. Just come by Saturday." I hung up. 20 minutes later, Julia pulled into the driveway. Her kids were in the back seat, laughing over a tablet. She stepped out, glanced at the bags at my feet, then looked away. I said nothing. She didn't invite me in. That night, I slept at Angela's, the woman I volunteered with at the center. I told her it was just a miscommunication, a mix-up, but I didn't believe myself. The next day, Ethan sent a group message. "Since you're retired now, maybe you'd be more comfortable staying with a friend or looking into assisted living. We're trying to create space for the kids. You've done so much for us, maybe it's time to rest." That was the moment. Not when the door wouldn't open, not when my name disappeared from the mailbox, but when they used the word rest like it was a dismissal, a slow erasure, a pat on the head followed by a shove out the back door. That was when I realized They weren't just excluding me, they were removing me. After the locks were changed, I tried to pretend things would return to normal. I told myself maybe they were overwhelmed, or distracted, or just terrible communicators. I told myself this wasn't intentional, but each day chipped a little more away. When I came by that Saturday as instructed, Michael met me at the door with a small tablet and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just press your thumb here," he said. "Now you're back in the system." Back in the system. Like I was a service technician or a delivery driver, not a mother. Not the woman who scrubbed these floors and cried on those stairs and built this house with her own 2 hands. Inside, the living room had been rearranged again, my antique lamp gone, replaced by some minimalist floor piece Julia probably saw on Pinterest. The family portraits from the stairwell, taken down. Ethan said the walls needed repainting. They'd put everything back up later. I knew they wouldn't. Worse still, I began to notice hushed conversations when I entered a room. Julia's husband would stop talking mid-sentence. Michael would close his laptop too quickly. One afternoon, I caught a glimpse of an email subject line before he minimized the window. Power of attorney steps and options. That night, I overheard Ethan talking to his wife on the phone. She's starting to ask questions. If she digs too deep, it'll complicate everything. We need to push her toward a decision soon. I didn't ask what decision he meant, because I already knew. They weren't just trying to remove me physically. They were laying the groundwork legally, emotionally, financially to make sure I wouldn't come back. That's when the ache turned to anger. Not loud, not dramatic, just a slow, steady fire under the surface. They thought I was old. They thought I was tired. They forgot I was still their mother. And I had built more than just this house. I had built all of them, and I wasn't done yet. I started collecting the signs like breadcrumbs. At first, it was for my own sanity proof that I wasn't imagining the shift, the coldness, the way the walls no longer echoed with recognition when I passed through the halls. But the more I looked, the more I found. The first real clue came by accident. I was at Angela's house again, helping her scan some medical paperwork for her mother. While using her printer, I noticed an old folder in my tote bag labeled House Original Deed. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside, beneath the worn-out deed transfer documents and a letter George and I had once drafted about our family legacy, was a newer sheet I didn't recognize. It had my name on it, but not in my handwriting. A notarized authorization form, dated 6 months ago, authorizing Ethan to act as sole decision-maker in all property, banking, and medical affairs on my behalf. I froze. The signature looked like mine. Even the flourish at the end of the E was uncanny, but I hadn't signed it. Angela looked over my shoulder and whispered, "That's not your writing, and they know it." That night, I pulled out every old envelope, utility bill, tax form, anything that had my handwriting. I started comparing, stroke by stroke, loop by loop. They had forged my signature, and not just once. There were 2 more forms in a folder labeled Shared Finances that I found on Julia's desk the next day when I told her I was looking for my old tax returns. One document transferred full rights of the joint family account where my retirement check still landed to Michael. The other authorized Julia to make decisions in my absence regarding property disposition. Property disposition. I sat in the car outside the grocery store with those pages trembling in my hands. I didn't buy anything. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to the county clerk's office, and what I found there set my pulse to ice. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan had filed a residency change affidavit stating that I had voluntarily relinquished full occupancy of the house and now resided off premises. Why? Because with that affidavit on file, they could refinance the home without my approval. The house I built, the house I gave, the house they were now trying to turn into something I'd never be allowed back into. But that wasn't all. At the clerk's counter, I asked to view the property record on file. The woman behind the desk frowned, clicked through a few screens, then printed a file with a pale yellow highlighter line drawn across the top. Intent to sell, subject to refinance approval. Filed by Ethan and Julia just 2 days ago. They were planning to sell the house. To sell it. To strangers. Without telling me. Without needing my consent because, on paper, I had already been removed from everything. I stood there frozen. The clerk asked, "Is everything okay?" "Ma'am." I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the years I'd spent inside those walls watching toddlers take their first steps, hosting birthday dinners, helping with science projects, grieving George. And now, a few signatures faked or manipulated had made it all vanish. For a long moment, I felt nothing, not even grief, just wait. But then something flickered inside me, a kind of old, stubborn resolve, the same steel that held me together when I buried my husband, the same grit I used to survive a life of balancing books and raising 3 children alone. They thought I was finished. They forgot who raised them. I looked up at the clerk and said softly, "No, but it will be." The morning after I visited the county clerk's office, I returned home as if nothing had changed. but everything had. I watched Ethan stir his coffee in the kitchen, eyes scanning headlines on his phone, unaware that I now knew what he had done. Julia passed me without a glance, Michael said. Morning. Like nothing had ever broken. But I was no longer their mother in the way they expected. I had shifted quietly, internally into someone they hadn't met yet, someone they hadn't planned for. That week, the pressure mounted. Ethan brought up assisted living over dinner. We found this amazing place near the park, he said, as if he were offering me a cruise. You'd have your own room, privacy, and the staff handles everything. No stress. I asked, who's paying for it? Silence. Then Julia said, you've always said you didn't want to be a burden, Mom. Michael added, it's not that we don't want you here. We just think it's time for something new. I said nothing. I smiled and cleared the plates. The next day, my debit card declined at the pharmacy. Twice. I checked my balance on the way home empty. The joint account had been drained. That night, I stood in the hallway outside Julia's room. I heard her on the phone. She hasn't moved the rest of her things out yet. No, I don't think she has a clue. Once it's done, we'll finalize the sale. We're just waiting on that final bank approval. I walked back to my room without a word. They were suffocating me with logistics paper trails. Procedures? Cold smiles. They weren't yelling or slamming doors. No, they were too polished for that. This was a slow erasure, bureaucratic exile. And then came the threat. Ethan left a pamphlet on my nightstand, Care Transitions for Aging Parents. Inside, a sticky note. Let's talk soon. It'll be easier if you cooperate. I stared at that word. Cooperate, as if I were a criminal, as if reclaiming my life was insubordination. But they'd made one mistake. They assumed I had no one. They didn't know I had already met with an elder law attorney 2 weeks ago out of curiosity. I told myself at the time. Her name was Brenda. Sharp, quietly ruthless. She had told me, they're walking a legal tightrope, and they don't know you're holding the scissors. I hadn't contacted her since, but I would still. The worst moment came later that week, when Julia sat me down and said plainly, if you're going to make this harder than it needs to be, we might need to explore a guardianship hearing. Ethan has already spoken to an attorney. A guardianship hearing, to have me declared mentally unfit, to take away my ability to make legal decisions? I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd, so invasive, so cruel. I'm not senile, I said. I'm not confused. No one's saying that, she replied with a tight smile. We just want what's best for you. And frankly, for the house too. For the house, not for me. It was never about care. It was about control. They didn't want to protect me. They wanted to remove me quietly, neatly, legally. They wanted to win by default, but they'd forgotten one thing. I may have retired from my job, but I hadn't retired from being a mother, and I hadn't retired from knowing how to fight. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the faint hum of the HVAC system. The house, once my sanctuary, now whispered betrayal in every creak of its floorboards. At 3:00 a.m., I got up, put on my robe, and went down to the basement. There was a filing cabinet down there, one George and I had used for decades. After he passed, the kids rarely went down there. Too dusty, too old-fashioned, Julia had said. I opened the top drawer and began pulling files. Mortgage statements, renovation receipts, original contracts, our marriage license, his death certificate. I sat cross-legged on the cold cement floor and began to reconstruct the past. There it was, a living trust document from 2008. It named me as the sole trustee, and all decisions about the home, including refinancing or sale, required my written consent even if ownership had been transferred. And then I found it, a letter from George to our children, written in his handwriting, dated just weeks before he died. I had forgotten he ever wrote it. The envelope read, "To be opened only if Mom is ever mistreated." My hands trembled as I read, "This house is your mother's, not because her name is on every page, not because of the money she put in, but because she stayed, because she carried all of us through every storm. If you ever use what I left behind to hurt her, then you've lost the right to call it home." I closed the letter, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes, but I didn't cry. Instead, I scanned it, photographed every page, uploaded them to a secure folder Brenda had told me to prepare. Then I went further. Michael's laptop was often left charging in the kitchen. That morning, while he showered, I opened it. The password was his birthday. Pathetic. Inside a folder titled Project Legacy, I found a spreadsheet, color-coded, calculated, the house's projected market value, debt-to-equity ratios, legal deadlines, a timeline for when I would exit the property, notes about transferring utilities. I was listed as tenant temporary. They had planned everything down to the week, and they weren't just selling the house. They were leveraging it to finance something bigger. In a folder titled Next Phase, I found the real plan. Ethan and Julia were working with a private investor to launch a boutique real estate venture. They needed capital liquid, fast, and I was their collateral. Suddenly, The urgency made sense. The sweet talk, the forced smiles, the sticky notes with "let's talk" written like a suggestion instead of a threat. They needed me out not because they didn't love me, but because I was in the way. And as I scrolled through their emails, brags about timing, deals, future office spaces, I realized something even worse. They weren't nervous. They weren't conflicted. They were excited. I wasn't an aging mother in need of care. I was a number in a spreadsheet, a problem to be phased out. I closed the laptop and walked back to my room, my spine straighter than it had been in weeks. For a moment, I stood by the window and looked out at the backyard. The one George had built a swing set in, the one I used to rake leaves in with a cup of cider in hand. They had forgotten all of that, but I hadn't. And if they wanted to erase me from the story of this house, they were going to have to learn something first. I write the ending, not them. From the outside, nothing changed. I still made coffee in the mornings, still smiled when Michael made small talk, still nodded along when Ethan talked about market interest rates. I didn't storm out. I didn't scream. That's not how you win against people who've convinced themselves they're smarter than you. You let them underestimate you. That's when you're most dangerous. My first move was calling Brenda. I told her everything. She didn't gasp or hesitate. She simply said, "Good. Now we start." Over the next week, I followed her instructions. I documented everything, every account transfer, every bank transaction. Every time someone referred to me as a temporary tenant, I installed a hidden recorder in the hallway where Julia took most of her calls. I started forwarding suspicious emails to a secure inbox. I even backed up Michael's entire laptop onto an external drive while he was on a weekend trip. Brenda filed an injunction to freeze all property-related activity tied to my name. Quietly, strategically, she used the trust document, the forged signature proof, and the letter from George as supporting exhibits. We didn't go nuclear, not yet. We set traps. Then I took it a step further. I scheduled a full medical and psychological evaluation at the local clinic on my own terms. I passed with flying colors, not only mentally fit but physically active, capable, and highly lucid. The report ran 6 pages long, signed by 3 specialists. Brenda said it would be the nail in the coffin if they ever tried for guardianship. The day after I picked up the report, I hosted a dinner. I cooked everything: Ethan's favorite roast, Julia's preferred salad, Michael's ridiculous gluten-free pie. I told them I was feeling better and more open to discussing the future. They came, full of charm and shallow praise. Julia even brought wine. While we ate, I asked casual questions. What would happen if the refinancing didn't go through? I mused. Would the investors pull out? Ethan hesitated, just for a second. That was enough. I smiled, poured more wine, and said nothing else. That night, I uploaded the dinner conversation from the recorder I'd placed under the dining table. The part where Julia said, "We just need her to sign one more document and it's all locked in." The part where Ethan muttered, "She'll go along with it. She always does." I labeled the file, "Overconfidence, MP3. The next morning, I went to the post office. I mailed certified letters to the investor group they were working with. Inside, a legal notice from Brenda's firm stating I had no intention to vacate the property, and any transaction would be subject to immediate litigation. Then, I called my friend Melissa, a reporter who owed me a favor from years ago. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then she said, "Evelyn, this isn't just a family squabble. This is financial elder abuse. And I think you're sitting on a story the whole state should hear." We agreed to keep my name anonymous for now, but she began her own investigation. I gave her access to redacted documents, masked audio clips, a timeline. Melissa had a reputation for cutting through facades. I knew she would find more than I even suspected. That night, I sat on the porch alone. The lights were off inside. The house felt still, but not peaceful, like it was holding its breath. I wasn't afraid anymore. They'd spent months building a trap, and now they were standing in mine. It began on a Tuesday. The house was unusually quiet. Ethan was out with the investor for another strategy meeting, and Julia was working remotely from the sunroom. I brewed my coffee like always, measured, quiet, deliberate, and slipped the printed medical report into a manila envelope. I called for a house meeting. They both looked up when I entered the room. Ethan frowned. Julia lowered her laptop lid slowly. "I want to talk about the future," I said calmly. They exchanged a quick glance, cautious, but intrigued. "I've been thinking about your offer. The care home," I continued. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am in the way." Ethan leaned forward slightly. Julia tilted her head like a therapist preparing to validate my trauma. "I just have a few things I need to handle first." I pulled out the envelope and placed it on the table. "My final health evaluation. I had it done last week. 3 specialists cleared me. I'm of sound mind and body, not a burden, not in decline, not incompetent." Ethan blinked. Julia looked down at her lap. "Also," I said, pulling out a flash drive, "this contains voice recordings from your conversations discussing forged documents. illegal account transfers, and your plan to sell the house without my consent. You'll find one in particular where you referred to me as the last obstacle." Julia's face turned pale. "I've already sent a copy to my attorney, and a second to a journalist who's preparing a story on elder financial exploitation. She has everything your name's redacted for now." I let that hang for a moment. Then I reached into my bag and retrieved one final envelope, Brenda's cease and desist notice, along with the legal injunction freezing the property transaction. I laid it flat in front of Ethan. "You wanted to play chess," I said softly, "but I was always the queen on this board. You just forgot." He stood up fast, knocking his chair over. "You're blackmailing us." "No," I said. "I'm protecting myself, something you clearly never planned to do for me." Julia's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her lip trembled, and for once, the rehearsed calm cracked. I walked out of the room without waiting for a response. 3 hours later, I received an email from Melissa. "Story scheduled for release Friday morning. Legal reviewed everything. It's airtight." That evening, Michael avoided me. Julia cried in the bathroom. Ethan tried calling the investor, who apparently was now reassessing the deal. The next morning, a sleek car pulled into the driveway. A courier stepped out and delivered a formal notice from the bank. Due to the injunction and legal complications, the refinance was canceled. Their entire scheme unraveled in real time. Utilities froze. Loan conversations stalled. Ethan's pitch to a secondary investor was withdrawn. The title company paused all progress. And Melissa, she sent a follow-up request asking if I'd be willing to go on record because now other families were reaching out with similar stories. By Thursday, 2 other families had come forward. One case involved a widow in Wisconsin. Another, a retired school principal in Oregon. Same patterns, same quiet betrayal. It was no longer just about me. The irony, the only person in the house still holding everything together, was me. I made dinner that night. Nothing fancy, just meatloaf, salad, mashed potatoes, comfort food. They didn't say much during the meal. I didn't need them to. The silence was enough. Afterward, I went to the garage and pulled out an old lawn chair. I sat out under the stars, breathing for the first time in months. This wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of the end for their narrative. They could no longer paint me as fragile, confused, or irrelevant. I wasn't just back in control. I had never actually lost it. They just forgot who built this house to begin with. And now they remembered. The headline dropped Friday morning at 7:00 a.m. Exclusive. Elder financial exploitation hidden behind suburban doors. It was front page digital. Within an hour, it had been shared over 1,000 times. The article didn't name names, but the details were unmistakable. An aging widow nearly forced out of her own home. Signatures forged. Accounts emptied. Trust broken by blood. The story spread like wildfire. Calls started pouring in. Brenda's office received inquiries from legal firms and nonprofits offering support. Melissa's inbox filled with stories from other elderly parents too ashamed or too afraid to speak until now. My phone buzzed with blocked calls I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I had already spoken. Ethan and Julia were stunned into silence. Michael was the first to speak. "We didn't know it would go this far," he said quietly at breakfast, staring into his cereal like it might offer redemption. "You mean you didn't expect me to fight back?" I replied. No one argued. By midday, the investor had fully withdrawn. Their boutique real estate venture was officially shelved. Even worse, their names, though not listed, had already started circulating in whispers within their professional circles. The shame hit them like a slow, public collapse. Julia received a call from her HR department. "Just to check in," they said, given what's been in the news. Ethan stopped talking about work altogether. I watched it all unfold with eerie calm, but I wasn't finished. At 3:00 p.m., I sat down at the dining table and called a family meeting. They trickled in, subdued. No performative smiles this time, just the weight of exposure pressing down on their shoulders. "This house," I began, "was never about bricks and beams. It was about roots, legacy. What you did wasn't just illegal, it was cruel. You tried to erase me while I was still breathing." Ethan tried to interject. I held up a hand. "You don't get to speak until I'm done." They froze. I pulled out the living trust, the forged signature report, and the medical clearance. Then I added a 4th document, a newly drafted quitclaim deed. "I'm not kicking you out," I said, "but this house will no longer be in your names. I'm transferring it into a protected trust in my name. Brenda will oversee it. You may live here, but you will not control it. Not anymore." Julia blinked. "But what if something happens to you? Then the trust dictates what happens. Not you." There was no room for discussion. The papers had already been signed. I stood up. "There's one more thing." From my coat pocket, I slid 3 envelopes onto the table, one for each of them. Inside were printed bank statements, one showing the drained account, the other showing a new account with my name only. The third, a letter informing them I'd cut off all financial ties. "You are adults," I said. And from now on, you will act like it. Michael looked like he might cry. Julia reached for her envelope with shaking hands. Ethan just stared blankly at the wall, jaw tight, refusing to meet my gaze. But I wasn't angry anymore. What I felt was release. For so long, I had equated love with sacrifice. I had poured everything into these children, into this home, into the illusion that family would always protect its own, and they had nearly devoured me for it. But now I stood, not in vengeance, not in rage, in clarity. You can choose how you want to live from here on, I said. But know this, I will never again finance my own erasure. Then I walked out of the room slowly, deliberately, my spine straighter than it had been in years. And behind me, not one of them followed. 2 days passed without a word. No knocks on my door, no passive-aggressive comments at breakfast. The house was quiet, not peacefully, but uncomfortably so. A silence thick with shame, confusion, and the brittle tension of a family forced to look inward. On the third morning, Julia approached me in the garden. I was trimming the rose bushes, something I used to do with George. She lingered at the edge of the path, twisting her hands together like a nervous child. She looked smaller, somehow older, not physically, but emotionally, worn. I wanted to apologize, she said finally, for everything. I kept trimming. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, she continued, but I need to try. I looked up. Why now? She hesitated. Because the story, it changed things. My supervisor asked if I was involved. Our investor group is blacklisted. Ethan lost 2 clients. I've never felt more exposed. I nodded slowly. So this is about saving yourself? No, she said quickly, then softened. I mean, at first, maybe, but then I read the article again, and I saw the comment you left. I raised an eyebrow. I didn't leave a comment. She blinked. You didn't? Someone using your name said? They forgot who kept the lights on for decades. But I remember, and I've reclaimed the switch. A slow smile tugged at the corner of my lips. Maybe someone else remembers. Julia paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. I stayed up late last night reading old family journals, letters Dad wrote, photos of you baking with us when we were little. And I realized I never really saw you as a person, just as a resource. She handed me a folder. Inside were revised trust documents. Her name was removed. Ethan's too. The property and its management would fall entirely to me and Brenda. I want to formally relinquish my interest, Julia said, not because I have to, but because, I think you were right, this house isn't just real estate, it's history. And I tried to treat it like a transaction. I studied her face. There was no defensiveness, no calculation, just exhaustion and something like regret. What do you want in return? I asked. Julia swallowed hard. Nothing. But I'd like to start earning back your trust. If that's even possible. There was a long silence between us. The garden was quiet except for the soft buzz of a bee darting between the lavender. I won't make promises, I said, and I won't forget what happened. But I believe people can change if they want it enough. She nodded quickly. I do. Then you can start by helping me replant the hydrangeas. She blinked. Now, no time like the present. She dropped her bag and walked over. We worked in silence, hands dirty with soil and sweat. But for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like something trying to grow again. A month later, the house felt different, not quieter, exactly, but softer, calmer. There were still sharp edges, memories too fresh to be ignored, but the temperature of the air had shifted. It was no longer survival. It was reconstruction. Julia had stayed true to her word. She took over the garden chores on weekends, joined me for walks, and even helped repaint the living room the same shade George once picked. A warm ivory white. She still flinched whenever the article came up, but she no longer avoided it. She asked questions. She listened. Ethan moved out. He didn't leave with a speech or a scream, just a curt nod, a box of clothes, and a note left on the kitchen table. I guess I underestimated you. Michael, surprisingly, remained. He was quiet, awkward, but slowly less defensive. He began asking about budgeting, cooking, and even joined Julia and me for dinner without needing to be asked. I didn't offer forgiveness. That's not how it works. But I began to offer space, for them to be people, not just broken sons and daughters, but adults who could choose to rebuild or walk away. The trust was finalized. The house was mine again legally, emotionally, spiritually. I planted new flowers beneath the front windows. Daffodils, Evelyn's favorite. My name, Melissa's article continued to gain traction. It was syndicated to multiple news outlets. I received a handwritten letter from a woman in Ohio who had been through the same thing. Your voice helped me find mine, she wrote. I placed the letter in a box beside George's, his last one to the kids. I imagined him smirking as he read what had happened. The woman who once felt erased now had a paper trail a mile long, and all of it told the truth. One morning, as I stood by the window with my tea, Julia walked in holding an old photo album. "Do you want to go through this?" she asked. I looked at her, really looked at her. The shadows were still there, but so was something else. Hope. I nodded. Yes, let's remember who we were and decide who we want to be. We sat on the living room floor, flipping through pages. Birthdays, holidays, backyard swings, blurry Polaroids of smiles that once came easier. There was a silent kind of healing in it, a reclaiming of memory on our own terms. The final photo in the book was of me, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, building the porch steps brick by brick. Sweat streaked across my cheeks. George had written beneath it, "The foundation of this family." I closed the album slowly and smiled. They tried to erase me. They underestimated the quiet power of a woman who had spent her whole life holding others up. But I rebuilt myself stronger, steadier, unshakable. And this time, I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for me. Later that evening, as twilight wrapped the house in violet blue, I stepped outside barefoot onto the front porch, the very one I'd built with my own hands. I sat down on the steps, hands resting on my knees, feeling the solidness beneath me. A breeze swept through the garden, rustling the daffodils, and for the first time in a long, long while, I felt entirely, unapologetically whole.